In this live session review, let's look at our habitual standing postures, almost the position we're unaware of, which for me is the most realistic posture, the one you're unaware of. And really how we move in swing is often really an expansion of or an extension of just those habitual standing positions we have. So much of what we see in swing and much of how the player moves is simply influenced and controlled by the very unaware standing frames that we have, which is hopefully very evident in this example here of how the player stands when they very much hang off that right hip. The left foot sits forwards, the left shoulder is elevated, the left hip is downwards, and then equally on the right side, that very compressed, elevated right hip, very kind of down with that kind of right shoulder at rest. So that very unaware habitual standing posture in this particular player's case almost really then migrated through and hugely encouraged them to kind of move in the way that they did. So much of what they do in swing is simply their way of moving around the most realistic definition of posture for me, which is the one we are simply unaware of. So let's now relate that back to how this player moves in swing. So we have two real-time values live on display currently, the forward and backward pelvis bend and the thorax lateral flexion or side bend, depending on which reference system one wishes to use. F represents the forward bend of the pelvis, L or the L sign represents the lead side being slightly elevated or laterally flexed to the right. If we now remove the hand and arm, you can almost see that person's kind of habitual unaware standing posture, and really how that displays quite evidently through their start position in golf, how elevated the right side of the pelvis sits, how down the right shoulder sits, and then equally so how down the left side of the pelvis sits or the left hip, and how up that left shoulder sits. So much of how they stand almost in that very unaware habitual way of life, in essence then kind of migrates through once more and really influencing once more to stand in the way they stand at address. Moving the player through back, so now the values actually display typically within anatomy almost as the dreaded E word of expectation. Expectation in many ways is what creates many issues in life and certainly within movement, but we'll call it expectation for the purpose of this discussion. Really how the player moves through backswing is within accepted and expected anatomical ranges, but it's only when they move in transition when we really start to increase the force through the system. And why the standing habitual posture is so relevant, it's when we put significant force and really require that system to deform and move in a really expansive, adaptive way, that often the forces we put through the body will often then really exploit and expose even greater those dominant standing positions that we have. So often why people can move well through backswing despite a very adapted start position, certainly in this particular player's case, he was a very established and advanced player, is because the force, those internal muscle actions that we are producing aren't really of a real significant high enough value and velocity that they don't really kind of deform the system that much. However, in transition, when we really accelerate and get that very elastic, very explosive movement in transition, that when we really submit and expose the player to significant forces in transition, often the forces we put through the system then really exploit and move through that adapted postural frame that we have. It's a bit like doing a very heavy squat. It's only when we get a little bit too much, for example, in a squat, do we then start to really lose that kind of spine control and lower limb movement. So we have two values on display here. We have the pelvis bend value of, let's call it 8 degrees forward bend, and a lateral thorax side bend value of 32 degrees for this discussion of left lateral flexion. If we go straight to top of backswing and stop, which is represented by the T button here, as we start to move in downswing and transition now, you'll see a very dominant and very evident change in both of those values. If you move the player into downswing, how both of those values continue going up fairly significantly. So the pelvis increases its forward bend in transition, and also the rib cage continues, or the spine in this case, continues going more into right lateral flexion. In essence, exactly how the player stands in that very unaware habitual posture. So when we put significant force, which is what happens in transition, both externally and intrinsically internally, it really encourages the player to move in transition in a very matched, aligned way to how they stand. Very much compressed in that upper spine, very much hanging forwards off that right hip and address, which is why we now see the shape in that spine and rib cage is very closely aligned to really how they stand in their start position. Adding in now and looking at how this also influences other areas within their movement. The plots in the right hand window are the trail wrist values. So we have the green plot, which represents the forearm supination and pronation. The blue plot represents the wrist flexion and extension, and the silver plot represents the trail wrist ulnar and radial deviation. This is where historical evidence and really case study history becomes of such value and of such relevance and meaningful value now, that typically when connecting back to wrist pain, especially in the trail wrist, anytime you see in downswing, so downswing really being defined by the T and I phase in that window. So essentially the yellow vertical plot, which is moving and corresponds with the animation on the left hand side, is the downswing phase, T being top and I representing impact. Anytime you see the green plot, the blue plot and the silver plot rapidly spiking and dropping downwards, in essence increasing pronation, extension and radial deviation in downswing, there's significant history and case study evidence that relate back to issues such as trail wrist pain, elbow pain, right shoulder pain and neck pain. But once more again, that how the wrist is having to adapt the external forces and the intrinsic movements the wrist is now having to make in essence in response to the start position they had in that very unaware habitual movement. When excessive force is put through the system in transition, it almost moves us and encourages back to stand in those very adaptive positions. This now actually starts to put excessive demands and high loads through that trail wrist. And the irony in this particular player's case was they have a history of trail wrist and right side neck pain. However, as we know from past tutorials, the joints that get sore are invariably the issue. It's actually the healthy joints that are having to adapt and adjust more in an attempt to move around joints and segments that don't like movement. So in this case, why did the player get wrist pain and neck pain? It was their way of having to adapt because of how they move in transition very much being influenced by how they stand and address. And that really is the basis of pain, that where you get pain, in essence, to solve the problem, we have to really work away from the problem. So in this particular player's case, to really resolve wrist pain and neck pain, we actually have to look at how they stand anatomically and habitually through life. Just providing a plot reference as a normative reference to relate against. The pop-up window on screen here, you're seeing very healthy, wonderful